Welcome. Tonight, we'll explore the quiet history of the Erie Canal, a steady project that shaped America. Let its calm pace guide you to sleep. The construction of the Erie Canal. In the early 19th century, in the United States, the idea of building a canal to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes had been floating around for some time. The idea wasn't new. People had been thinking about connecting the waters of the Hudson River with Lake Erie, a body of water hundreds of miles west of the Hudson. However, it wasn't until 1817 that serious efforts began to take shape. The project was proposed primarily by DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York. Clinton believed that if the state of New York could build a canal, it would revolutionize trade in the United States. At the time, much of the trade between the eastern and western parts of the country took place over land, which was expensive, slow, and often difficult. Ships could navigate along the coast, but getting between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic was a different challenge entirely. There was no easy way to move goods from the lakes to the ocean. Now, it's important to note that the Erie Canal would span from the Hudson River, in the eastern part of the state, all the way to Lake Erie in the west. It was to be about 363 miles long, cutting through the state of New York, crossing rivers, lakes, and forests. This project, once completed, would be the longest canal in the world at the time. But before anything could get underway, there was a great deal of surveying and planning to be done. The first part of the process was to determine the best route for the canal. To do this, a team of surveyors was dispatched to the region to measure elevations, figure out the lay of the land, and see how the canal could be built in the most efficient way. Of course, this was a slow and tedious process. Every inch of land had to be measured carefully. In some places, it seemed like the land was perfect for a canal, but in others, the ground was uneven, hilly, or otherwise unsuitable for digging. One of the first problems was deciding how to deal with the difference in elevation between Albany and Buffalo. Albany, the eastern terminus of the canal, sits at a higher elevation than Buffalo on Lake Erie. This meant that to make sure boats could travel smoothly from one city to the other, locks would have to be built. Locks are chambers used to raise and lower boats from one level to another. So, after surveying the land, engineers decided that 83 locks would be necessary to traverse the entire canal route. Each lock had to be designed and carefully constructed, which added a great deal of time and effort to the project. The next step was the actual digging of the canal. Thousands of workers were hired, many of whom were immigrants, particularly Irish workers who had come to the United States seeking work. The digging process was grueling. Most of the work was done by hand with shovels, pickaxes, and simple tools. It wasn't like the modern machinery we think of today. Everything was done by muscle and sweat. The workers had to dig long, narrow ditches through the earth, removing tons of dirt, rock, and debris. The workers would dig a section of the canal, then build a retaining wall to hold the water in. After that, they would move on to the next section. The digging was slow, and the workers had to deal with the elements: extreme heat in the summer, cold winters, and heavy rain that would make the ground soft and muddy. Sometimes the canal would flood, and they would have to wait for the water to subside before they could continue. The process was repetitive and painstaking, with no real excitement, just the steady rhythm of shovels and pickaxes digging through the earth. Meanwhile, in other parts of the project, workers were constructing the locks. These were made of large, heavy stones and timber. The construction of each lock required a careful process of building stone walls and setting up the mechanisms that would open and close the gates. Each lock had to be perfect, and they were all constructed one by one in painstaking detail. As the years passed, work on the canal continued at a steady pace. In total, it took about 8 years to complete the entire canal. During this time, the cost of construction was rising, and many people began to question whether it would ever be finished. The original budget for the canal had been much lower than the actual costs, and as the project dragged on, it seemed like it might never be completed. However, despite the delays, the workers pushed forward. The project was a massive undertaking, and it wasn't just about digging a trench. There were numerous bridges to be built over the canal, aqueducts to carry water over rivers, and tunnels to be dug through hills. The project was growing in complexity. The workers had to deal with difficult terrain, rocky land, and unpredictable weather. But still, the work continued at a slow pace. In 1825, after nearly 8 years of backbreaking labor, the Erie Canal was finally completed. It had taken an enormous amount of time, money, and effort to build, but it was finally done. The canal was 363 miles long, and it connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie. In the end, the canal cost more than $7 million, far more than initially estimated. But it was still a success. The canal was celebrated, though not with the fanfare you might expect from such a massive project. The opening was marked by a simple event. Governor DeWitt Clinton, who had been the driving force behind the canal's creation, was at the forefront of the celebration. He sailed the first boat from Albany to Buffalo, symbolizing the completion of the canal. The boat was filled with water from the Atlantic Ocean, and the journey was slow but steady. It was not an exciting journey. It was a long, quiet trip, as the boat traveled slowly along the canal, making stops at each lock along the way. Over time, the canal proved to be extremely successful in terms of trade. It provided an efficient route for transporting goods between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. This made it easier for farmers, manufacturers, and merchants to send their products from the western United States to the eastern markets, and vice versa. The canal facilitated the growth of cities like Buffalo, Syracuse, and Rochester, which saw an increase in population and industry as a result. But even with all its success, the canal's construction had been slow and methodical, with no dramatic moments of crisis or excitement. It wasn't like the building of great monuments or the conquests of war. It was simply a long, tiring effort that required persistence. The Erie Canal became a vital part of America's infrastructure, but its story was more about steady work than grand triumphs. As time went on, the Erie Canal remained a key part of the transportation network in the United States. It continued to be used for the transportation of goods and people for many decades. However, with the advent of railroads and modern technology, the canal eventually became less important for long-distance trade. Even today, the canal exists in part, though much of it has been replaced by modern infrastructure. It remains a testament to the hard work and slow progress that helped shape the early American economy, though it is far less exciting to remember than many other historical events.